Hey folks, Matt Cuda here. Welcome to the second edition of Reviews from the Blind. Today, I am looking, or we are looking, at this big boy. The Canon 400mm EF 2.8 L version 2. This is a lens that was designed by Canon to be used by the sports professional. I would say it wasn't even designed for wildlife per se. It was designed for sports. It was designed for low light sporting events such as night light, playing under the lights, soccer, football, basketball. It's a heavy lens coming in at over 8 pounds. It is certainly amazing as far as build quality. It has this massive hood. Yeah, that's a massive hood. I'll let you see the inside of that front element. That is one massive front element, and you can feel the weight. This is not a lens that you would want to take with you on a 3-mile hike. This is not a lens that you would want to lug around with you anywhere. It's designed to be on a monopod. It's designed to be on a tripod. It is not designed to be used on the go. It is not a run and gun kind of application. Coming in at $10,000, this lens is certainly not for the average man or the average wildlife photographer. The lens has a lot of features that you would typically see on a you know, a Canon L lens, or any Canon lens for that matter. You've got image stabilization. You've got 3 modes of image stabilization, actually. We're going to go into more detail on that a little bit later. You've got a focus preset switch, which is fairly uncommon. And I say it's fairly uncommon because it's very uncommon. Most lenses do not have that. It gives you the ability to set your focus at a distance. It's got a predefined distance. It's got a drop-in filter on the back. It's got, you know, your typical AF manual focus switches. Everything you would expect to see on a Canon L lens of this quality. You know, if I were to look at it again, you know, let's take this big lens hood off. It's ridiculous inside this car. You know, if you look at here, the focusing ring is extremely smooth. It does what it's supposed to do, right? It's just made for Sports Illustrated. It's made for AP stringers or whatever you happen to be in the news industry. Other than that, I mean, it is what it is. It's a chunk, and it's designed for a very specific market. But I thought you would enjoy seeing it, as it's not a typical kind of camera. I'm gonna go ahead and put it out the window here so we can actually see and hear it. Again, very difficult. You can see I'm having a hard time actually getting this out through the hole in my netting. It's just such a behemoth. Again, for wildlife work, no, it's in my opinion just too much. It's just too much. It's not necessary. Does it have an application? Absolutely. It's an f2.8 lens. I can really get some low light work done with this. However, when you're doing wildlife, you're working so close to the animals that a 2.8 lens is not extremely useful, because the depth of field will be so shallow that it's not even worth worrying about. I've got this all set up for doing bird photography here. It's very fast to focus, very fast. And a matter of fact, when you're holding down your focusing button on AI servo, I've never heard this noise before. It's, you know, typically you have that clicky kind of sound where it's trying to focus back and forth. Well, with this one, it does it so fast, it's almost a totally different sound that it makes.
And it may actually be a different sound altogether. I mean, it may be a different drive system,
Even though it says ultrasonic drive.
you know, I imagine they put different ones in these for different things. Image stabilization, extremely stable, extremely stable. I'm here, I'm locking it in. This thing ain't moving, you know. It is just locked right in.
No problems with autofocus and my drive. It's shooting at 10 frames per second. On the last review, remember we did the 300 f4. Remember I had a lot of problems with my autofocus. I would hold this in autofocus, I would depress it, and I was getting about 6 frames a second. That's 10 frames a second. So that's a problem no longer with this lens. The question you'll have to ask yourself is this lens worth the $10,000? Let's just say you're one of the few people out there that have that kind of expendable income. Is this going to be worth $10,000? That's what I'm going to hope to find out this weekend as I shoot with it. There's no birds out here right now. They're going back to roost. It's getting dark. But I am going to be shooting it from the car blind for the next day or two. And I will certainly let you know my thoughts and feelings. Coming up, we're going to be talking about the specifications. We're going to be talking about the calibration of the lens. I did calibrate this lens. It actually had to have a -2 compensation in it for micro focus adjust, which I thought was a little crazy for a lens of this caliber. However, one thing you have to understand is that this lens is well used. This lens is a Canon loaner. It's been probably at the Olympics. It's probably been to various sporting events across the United States and the world. And so there's that. Other than that, build quality, again, everything you would expect from Canon and more. I mean, this thing is the Cadillac, the Maserati, the Ferrari, whatever you want to call it. This is not a Hyundai, okay? This is not a just get you by lens. This is a lens that was designed for the discerning professional sports photographer. Now, if I bring this back in the car, because there's no birds out there tonight, that's for sure. One of the disappointments, and this is the kind of thing that drives me crazy about high quality gear. You pay $10,000 for this lens. They gave you a hood that doesn't work. This little knob right here, that little knob, it turns, and inside of it, right here, there's this little clip that actually digs into the kind of digs into the front of your camera. I mean, of your lens. Sorry. Well, when I got it, it was acting kind of funky, and it still worked, but then I tightened it down today and it got stuck. It's stuck. Ain't no turning this thing. So that's kind of silly. Come on, $10,000 lens. This thing better work for the life of that lens. I mean, we're talking about the expense. I could buy a good used car for the price of this lens. This thing better work right? I'm probably going to talk about this more at the end, but my feeling is that these lenses are going to be a thing of the past. And the reason I say that is, in the next 10 to 15 years, the cameras are going to advance so much that you're no longer going to need 2.8 lenses. You're not going to need lenses that weigh 8 and 10 pounds. Those days they're going to be over, folks. We're seeing the last of these lenses now, and with the sports industry and journalism, photojournalism in general, kind of going the way of the dinosaur, so is this lens. You're not going to be able to afford it. People that are on a budget, that are doing wildlife, that are doing sports as stringers, they're not going to be able to afford it. Canon is going to have to respond, in my opinion, in the next 10 years with lighter, much more expensive. By the way, version 3 is coming out here in September of 2018. I expect it to be lighter. I do expect it to have a similar price tag, if not more. But I think the day is coming where these are going away. You don't hear a lot of people predicting that. I am going to predict it. Other types of lenses may not in the 2.8 range. For example, the 200 2.8, I don't see that going away anytime soon. But these big behemoths, they're going away because lighter is better. And I'm hoping that Canon starts making some really affordable, high quality glass. Anyway, I'm gonna go out here, we're gonna do some shooting, and we're gonna come back and really talk about this lens and see what makes it tick. Okay, so let's go through the overall specifications of this lens. It weighs in at 8.4 pounds, which is a pretty big chunk of lens. It has a length of 13.5 inches, so fairly long lens. Longer with the, of course, with the lens hood. It's image stabilized. It's got mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3. It has a lens construction of 16 elements in 12 groups. It has a 400 millimeter focal length, of course. The image magnification, this is not a macro lens. It's 1 to 5.8. 9 aperture blades. The closest focusing is 8.86 feet. It does have a 52 millimeter drop in. I think that's a really good feature. The lens hood is a reversible lens hood, so it reverses for storage. It's got a removable tripod collar. Its aperture is f2.8 to f32, and it has an MSRP of $9,999 US. The used price for this was hard to find. I'm guessing it's going to be somewhere around $7,000, but I could not find any really good examples of good used pricing. I wanted to just take just a couple more minutes on the specifications here and just go through some of the specs that I feel like are good and the specs that I feel like are really bad. First and foremost, if you're going to talk about this lens, you've got to talk about the weight. The weight of this lens, being 8.4 pounds, is a lot to carry around. You're talking about the weight of a baby here, a human baby. So if you're going to be lugging this thing out into the wild, you're talking about basically taking 8.4 pounds undistributed and carrying that for possibly miles into the bush. And this is where I think this lens really loses versatility for the wildlife photographer. Personally, I would much rather have a lens in the 4 pound range and be able to carry that thing as far into the woods as I want to, not worry about getting too tired to carry it and so on and so forth. Because of that weight, I think you're really looking at using it for blinds, whether it be a car blind or a regular pop-up blind. You're going to be if you are going to use it outside of a blind, you're going to want a tripod and probably a gimbal head because of the weight of this. I think that's doable, but again, not a versatile lens. It's a fairly awkward lens. At 13.5 inches plus the lens hood, it's a pretty big lens, okay? And just maneuvering that in your blind or in your car or wherever you are is a difficult proposition. The image stabilization on this, it has 3 modes. The first mode is a stabilizer for the X and Y axes. Mode 2 stabilizes the vertical so you can pan better. And it provides roughly 4 stops of image stabilization. During my testing, I used the mode 1 almost the entire time. I found that it locked the image down very, very well. And so it gets definitely 5 stars on that. Now, it does have a mode 3, which is something that you find on Canon's bigger primes. And mode 3 is just simply that it doesn't have a preview of the image stabilizing. So when you press that shutter button down halfway and you're getting ready to fire,
it will not actually stabilize the image until right before the shutter fires. So you won't get that preview effect. The other things that are, of course, notable about it and very good, it has a very big tripod collar. And the foot on that tripod collar is long, and it has kind of a grip on top of it, so you can use that to shoot handheld with if you have to. I don't recommend shooting handheld with this lens at all. It's going to break your arm after 5 minutes. So I would, again, definitely looking at a tripod. I did really like the fact that it had a drop-in filter. I wish all lenses had drop-in filters, but I understand why they don't. It's an expensive feature, but I did really like that. It's got a 52 millimeter drop-in filter. I can only imagine how much it would cost to put a filter on the end of this lens. That would be insane. The other thing about it, you know, honestly, if we're going to pick a negative here in the specifications, it's got to be the price. You know, coming in at $10,000, let's be honest, that's a lot of money for a 400 millimeter lens. And so, I mean, if I were going to buy a prime telephoto of this quality, I think I would probably get the 300 2.8 for half the price. But that's just my opinion. Again, if you've got your heart set on this lens, certainly, you know, $10,000, if that's not a big deal for you, you know, go ahead and purchase it. So that's the specifications. Let's move on to the next piece of the puzzle here, which is micro adjusting. Now, with all my reviews, I do a micro adjust to actually calibrate the 400 millimeter lens to my Canon 7D Mark II. I'm a Canon 7D Mark II shooter primarily. I did not test it with my 1 series. I was a little bit surprised. Here, if you look at the image here, this is my final micro adjust. I did a -2 adjustment on this lens, and frankly, I was a bit surprised at that. You know, it could be that it wasn't quite, you know, calibrated simply because it's an older lens. Maybe it's been knocked around a little bit. There's a number of possibilities there. The point is, that's why your camera has this feature, and I highly recommend that you use this feature for all of your lenses. They should all be calibrated to your camera. If not, you're going out there with a possibility of getting unsharp images, especially if you're shooting in a situation where your wildlife is very close, say in your backyard or at a zoo or, you know, any kind of captive animal situation. You have very little depth of field, and if your camera is not calibrated to your lens properly, then you're going to have images that are soft at 100%. So, you know, we already talked about the build, the fit, the finish of this lens. It's amazing. Certainly everything you would expect from a lens of this caliber. You know, very, very heavy duty metal construction. Just phenomenal. I can't say enough. I mean, this is the top of the line lens. I mean, you're not going to complain about the build of this lens because it is just amazing. Let's move on to sharpness and optical quality, because this is where the rubber meets the road, right? This is where, if your lens isn't sharp, you know, throw it away, right? I mean, it's no good. So, as you may or may not know, my primary lens that I normally shoot with is the Sigma 150-600. And I wanted to compare that with this, but honestly and truly, this lens is sharper. There's no doubt about it. The 400 millimeter is sharper than the 150-600. I figured it would be. That's not a surprise. But what did surprise me was that the 150-600, after I went back, I've got a shot here of the Morning Dove, 100% crop of the Morning Dove. And as you can see, this 400 millimeter is a very sharp lens. The resolution's astounding. The eye is sharp. The beak is just amazingly detailed. The feather detail is amazing. But I went back and I compared it to some of my other Morning Dove shots that I've taken with my 150-600. And although, like I said, the 400 still beats it, just a tiny bit of extra sharpening, and the images were almost identical. You know, it was very hard to tell the difference. Again, I would still give the edge to the 400 millimeter. But if all you're looking for is sharpness, spending $10,000 for just sharpness is probably not the best idea. There's a lot of great third-party options out there. So on the next image here, we can see the final photograph of the Mourning Dove. This one has been fully processed, so it's been adjusted for contrast. It's been adjusted for white and black points. It's been adjusted for noise. Your typical contrast, all that stuff. A little bit of sharpening, didn't have to do a whole lot, but really fine. Great optical quality, as you would expect from a lens of this caliber. Okay, so moving on to autofocus. How was the autofocus? Of course, it was snappy. The AI servo was particularly good with this lens, which is to be expected. That's what it was designed for. So, out of the gate, this lens was a thoroughbred. I mean, this is a, Maserati, Ferrari, whatever you want, whatever car you want to put in there. I mean, that's an amazing, amazing lens. So, if we look down at this next picture, the reason I have this picture of this red-bellied woodpecker is simply because red-bellied woodpeckers, if you've ever photographed them, will bob their head a lot and they'll move around a lot. I mean, they are not a stationary bird at all. And the AI servo on this camera just kept up with that on this lens, just kept up with that bobbing head, I mean, perfectly. And, here we see that it's as sharp as can be again. So the only funny thing about this photo is that this time of year, the woodpeckers are molting, and so most of his head doesn't have any feathers on it. So you'll see some later on in the year, they'll start getting feathers for the winter time, but they're molting now. August and September is a terrible time to photograph birds. What about uses for this lens? Who's going to use this lens? Certainly this lens is going to be used by the sports professional. It was designed for sports. I mean, that is its primary use. So, the AP stringer, we talked about that before. The Sports Illustrated guys, the really well-known magazines, newspapers that can afford a lens of this quality are going to use this lens. Is it a good wildlife lens? Yes, it's a good wildlife lens. Again, with the the caveat that it is heavy and it's hard to maneuver. But I don't see any problem using this lens for wildlife. The only exception to that is run and gun wildlife photography. If you're someone that moves quickly, that stalks their subject, this lens is probably not for you. You're going to want a lighter combination that will allow you to move freely through the woods and the underbrush and so on and so forth. So what's my final verdict on this lens? This lens, from a technical perspective, it's going to work extremely well for you. Has amazing autofocus, amazing build quality. At 400 millimeters, it can handle most of your wildlife, most of your sporting needs. But I want to ask you a serious question. Is this lens the best choice for you? And only you can answer that, but let me try to help you. This is a big, heavy lens. A lot of photographers are going to go for the 300 2.8. If you want to get away from Canon and go to third party, you've got the Sigma 120 to 300 2.8. That's only 3,300 US. You've got the and supports a teleconverter also. You've got the 150 to 600, the Tamron, the Sigma. So if you're willing to lose a couple stops of light, that's probably a better option in my opinion. This is a very good low light lens, and so if you're doing a lot of sports under lighting at night, football, basketball, this is the lens for you. Hockey, this is the lens for you. It is designed for that specific use case. So in closing, quick summary, it's got great build quality. It's fully image stabilized to 4 stops. 2.8 aperture, great for low light. Sharpness is excellent. Best in class autofocus. It is extremely expensive at let's just say $10,000. It's large, clunky, has a clunky lens hood. The white color of the lens may draw unwanted attention from your subject. The focusing ring is extremely smooth. But again, that weight is going to be a huge factor for you. But that's really all we had for this episode. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye.